Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event on the IPCC report. We'll just wait for everybody to join. Yep, people are coming in. Right. Thank you, everybody. So, welcome. My name is Colin McQuiston, and I'm the Head of Climate and Resilience at Practical Action, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this timely event today. We will explore the findings of the latest IPCC Working Group 2 report, part of the 6th assessment report that was released on Monday. This report focuses on the impacts of climate change, exploring climate impacts across ecosystems, biodiversities, and human communities. The event today is hosted by the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. This alliance is a multi-sectoral partnership focused on finding practical ways to support communities in developed and developing countries strengthen their resilience to flood risk. The alliance has 9 members. They are Concern Worldwide, the International Federation of the Red Cross, the International Institute of Applied Systems and Analyses, IASA, Practical Action, Mercy Corps, the London School of Economics, Plan International, and Zurich Company and Z Zurich Foundation. We therefore bring together humanitarian, NGO, research and private sector partners to work together to deliver community-based flood resilience. Our vision is that floods have no negative impact on people and businesses' ability to thrive. However, as you will hear in this session, climate change is making this challenge even greater. Climate change is exacerbating natural hazards, changing climates are exploiting existing underlying vulnerability and generally making resilience much harder to achieve in practice. The panel today has 4 speakers. 2 who are authors of the report will speak about specific aspects of the IPCC report itself. 2 are from practitioner organisations and will highlight the reality of climate change and how it is playing out in alliance communities. But we also want to hear from you. So please don't hesitate to type your questions into the chat box, and we will have a question and answer session at the end. So please do prepare your questions. And when we get to the question and answer session, I'll ask you to raise your hands so that you can ask your questions. The presentation and the recording of the event will be available at the end of the meeting, so focus on listening. And each of the speakers will have their cameras on when they're speaking, and I will just remind them when there's 1 minute to go so that we have adequate time at the end of the session for your questions. Our first panelist is Erin Coughlin de Perez. Erin is an author of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report in the chapter Decision-Making Options for Managing Risk. She is a Dignitas Associate Professor at Tufts University and a Senior Advisor to the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre. Her research focuses on extreme events and how we can prepare for these. So I hand over to Erin to share an overview of the latest findings from the IPCC report.
Great, thank you, and welcome to everyone who is here today. Looking forward to this conversation, so please do pop those questions in the chat. This report is thousands of pages long, and so I'll give a bit of a taster for you right now on some main messages and a deep dive into some thinking about floods and early warning systems, and then we can have a longer conversation at the end. So if you'd like to advance the slide. Great. So this report was put together, one back please, by 270 authors from around the world. We were nominated by our governments. This was an intergovernmental panel on climate change where governments nominate these authors. They're selected and we worked together for several years to put together this assessment to answer this big question of what is going on with climate change. We are following a report that explains what is happening in the atmosphere. So we are seeing, maybe some stronger droughts and more frequent floods around the world. That was the conclusion of the first report. And our report answers the question of how do these events affect people? What are the consequences that we are seeing on ecosystems and on humans? And what might we expect in the future? So if you move to the next slide, one thing to highlight is that we do see impacts all around the world. So this is a plot of studies, how many studies we were finding in different places. One thing to highlight here is while there are studies of impacts showing and detailing climate impacts everywhere, there are regions that are more heavily researched than others, and this is a big gap that was difficult and frustrating when we're trying to really understand what climate change is doing, and we recognize that there are many understudied regions of the world. This is a bit of a call for action for all of you before the next report comes out. So if we move to the next slide, one big message that came out of this report is it's worse than we thought. So what I'm showing you here is a plot that was released in the last version of this report in 2014. In 2014, scientists who wrote this report named five key, five reasons for concern. So you'll see them listed on the bottom right here: unique and threatened systems, extreme weather events, distribution of impacts, global aggregate impacts, and large-scale singular events like a major ice sheet breaking off and melting. At that time, that gray horizontal line is showing where we were in 2014. So you can see that we were, that the higher gray horizontal line, we were hitting some yellow, some moderate risk and impact in some of these categories. And if you move to the next slide, the projections back in 2014 were that things would get substantially worse with climate change. And of course, depending on how much climate change, if we went in the blue scenario, we would be seeing some moderate and some high risks. And of course, the red scenario with lots and lots of climate change puts us at the top of those bars with very high risks and impacts in several categories. This was published in 2014. And now let's look, if you move to the next slide, what is the updated version of this today? So this is, again, the bottom part of the plot, and you can see on the right that we are already in yellow and red for a lot of these risks. So unique and threatened systems, for example, warm water coral reefs are threatened, and there are limits right now to what we could even possibly do to protect those ecosystems. And so this is happening faster than we had predicted in 2014 and stronger. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that our projections for the future have been revised to include a lot more purple. This is substantially different from the graph that you saw from 2014. The risks are worse. They are more purple, darker colors, and they are faster, right? Those colors change much lower in terms of how much climate change would it take to get some of these big, horrible impacts. The answer is they're starting to happen now, and they're coming faster than we thought if climate change continues in this way. So the big question to the report then, of course, was, what can we do about it? If you move to the next slide, what is exciting is that we put together many, a huge overview of many options for what does the solution space look like. This, of course, means decarbonizing our economy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there is an upcoming report at the end of this month that will give more detail in that aspect. But then it means building resilience, right, against floods, droughts, heat waves, storms, etc. And so I'm not expecting you to read this diagram that I've put here, but you can see that we've got a list of text of just tons and tons of adaptation options. And then on the right, all these blotches of color represent synergies with the Sustainable Development Goals. So while the report found that climate change is reducing the likelihood that we can actually achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, because of course, it's threatening food systems around the world, for example, the solutions and these adaptation possibilities are very synergistic with development goals. And the report talked a lot about pathways. How can we put this all together into a coherent pathway forward that includes decarbonization, it includes reducing inequality, it includes resilient food systems, flood protection, insurance, etc. I mean, the whole package in a way that helps us achieve these sustainable development goals and really build a climate resilient future. So what I'd like to do then in the last just a few minutes that I have is give a deep dive into one of these solutions that I know has been one of the pieces that this Flood Alliance has been working on for many years, and that's early warning systems. So if you move to the next slide, early warning systems was one of the adaptations that was mentioned the most across the report, because it's frankly, it's a very almost a generic thing that we can do and can be applicable in so many regions, right? There are many adaptations that are only applicable in certain places. Early warning systems are almost universally applicable. So every single chapter in this report, there were 18 chapters. Some chapters were on sectors like food, water, oceans, and some chapters were on regions, Africa, Asia, etc., North America, all the regions of the world. And then there were synthesis chapters at the end. Every single chapter included early warning systems as a potential adaptation. And what was fascinating is that there are many different ways that this has been already implemented and suggested to be implemented in the future. So early warning systems for disease outbreaks, early warning systems for floods, early warning systems for train tracks that might buckle in extreme heat. There were just all sorts of ways in which we can see these extreme events coming in the short term and take appropriate action before they cause devastation. And so here is the table where we listed a number of examples of early warning systems by key risk. So you can see that, risks to oceans, people are using early warning systems in fisheries, risks to human health, there are heat health early warning systems, etc. And no need to read all of these. You can find more details, of course, in the report. But this is to give you a flavor of the fact that this is one of the most commonly referred to tools in our toolbox. The report, of course, cautions that early warning systems are not necessarily beneficial. They can be done in ways that only benefit, people who are very rich and very well connected, for example, and leave many, many people behind if the warnings are not disseminated well. And they can be done in ways that are not as effective because people don't have the resources to take early action, for example. So we have a long path forward in how we can best use this tool in our toolbox. So if you move to the last slide, I'd like to also give two bigger picture questions that this assessment posed to the implementation of early warning systems. And one, yes, perfect. One was transformation. So Reinhard will speak a little bit about this at the end, but if we are going to adapt to such massive changes in our climate, this is going to require moving beyond business as usual. We can't make tiny little tweaks in our life and be done, but we need to start thinking fundamentally about maybe new livelihoods or new locations for infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So early warning systems traditionally have not been very thoughtful about transformation. It's been mostly about how to help people get back to where they were and protect existing livelihoods. So how can early warning systems start thinking about engaging in this question of transformation and fundamental change in society? So that's one question for all of you. And the second is, how can early warning systems adequately address unprecedented extremes? In the past, we've seen that early warning systems have been very focused on historical impacts, right? They're based on if you had floods in this region in the past, maybe you have an early warning system for floods. If you didn't, maybe you don't have an early warning system for floods. So how can we make sure that our investment in warnings and preparation keeps up with a changing climate and understands these unprecedented events that we're starting to have today? I'm sure you've seen them all over the media. So I'll stop there. Perfect, and turn it over to a deeper dive into what this can really look like in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erin. It was a great scene setter. It's worse than we thought. We're already experiencing limits, the urgency of climate resilient future. It was great to highlight the potential of early warning systems, one of the most commonly referenced tools in the toolbox. I love that phrase. And we need to build resilience. So it's great that we now have two speakers from the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance who are going to present climate change and what they're doing on the ground. So our first speaker is Kriti Shrestha. Kriti is the Knowledge Officer at Practical Action Nepal and works on the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance programme. Kriti has over 10 years experience on climate change, environmental research and policy advocacy, and she was the focal point of the Climate Change Network in Nepal. So Kriti, please tell us about the impacts of climate change in the Alliance communities in Nepal. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Colin. Namaste and good evening to all. As you all know, Practical Action through Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance works with communities in Western Nepal, and we help them find practical ways to strengthen their resilience to flood risk. So in my first slide, I'm going to show you the communities that we work with. As you can see in the photo, these are the communities we work with, which are arranged in 5 municipalities in 2 districts. And as you can see there, the Karnali River, it bifurcates into 2 braids and wreaks havoc to the nearby communities every monsoon. Now, due to climate change, the extent of the time that these communities suffer from flood and inundation has ranged beyond monsoon, with extreme flooding happening beyond monsoon season. Next slide, please, Lizzie. So a study that was conducted by ICIMOD and DHM in 2019 shows that the average temperature and average annual precipitation under RCP 4.5 is expected to increase in the medium-term period throughout the country, with precipitation concentrating largely in central and western Nepal. Now, western Nepal is where we work. And the intensity of monsoon has also increased, with highest magnitude of floods occurring in 2013 and 14. Next slide, please, Lizzie. So the climate change has made flooding and inundation more intense and uncertain. And in 2021, which was last year, we saw unseasonal October floods, the damage of which these communities are still reeling from. The heavy downpour that started in 17th October, when the government has supposedly declared that the monsoon had ended, moved eastwards, affecting all across the country and mostly in Karnali province and in the province number 1. The Ministry of Home Affairs reported at least 120 deaths, 44 serious injuries, and 12 people missing across 26 districts in Nepal. Now, the October floods came at a very critical time. It came when the communities were ready to take in their harvest, take in their hard-earned harvest, but due to the monsoon and flood, the crops were damaged, and it will result in a long-term food security for the communities, which will be more prominent in the days to come. The initial rapid assessments of the 2 districts that we work in shows that at least 9,400 hectares of agriculture land with standing crops have been damaged in Kailali district, while around 5,050 hectares of land with standing crops have been destroyed in Bardia district. Next slide, please, Lizzie. So while these communities are reeling from the shocks of extreme and uncertain events, our government is still prioritizing traditional, conventional grey infrastructure. Now, the photo that you can see is an embankment in the Karnali River system, which is called the Karnali River Management Project, which is a very expensive project, still being constructed, not completed, and the total cost is around 105 million USD plus. And a part of it, sadly, was damaged in the October floods. And as you can see in the picture there, it was damaged, breached in the Tigra community. Next slide, please, Lizzie. So while these embankments are huge and they take a lot of time and resources to be built and isn't very sustainable, our communities are increasingly advocating for sustainable, low-cost, greener alternatives as biodikes and as a part of nature-based solution. Now, in one of the communities that we work with, the Dakshinpur community, the Community Disaster Management Committee, or CDMCs, were able to leverage co-funding from their local government for the construction of a biodike. Their advocacy was based on the evidences generated from flood resilience measurement for community, also known as FRMC exercise, which helped them understand and unpack their resilience and advocate why they need to improve their natural capital. This biodike was able to survive the monsoon floods as well as the unseasonal October floods, and with proper maintenance will thrive over the years. It will not only provide protection to their agricultural lands, but would also help communities with additional income and other resources as time goes on. There were many bottlenecks when we were doing this, clashes with the national park, clashes with trying to convince the local governments, but with the advocacy and evidences through practical action and our partner CSTR, we were able to solve this. Next slide, please, Lizzie. These are the examples that we have to upscale in similar flood-prone communities. But for this, our communities and their local governments need help. We need, first of all, more climate finance that can be used to reduce these risks, help these communities adapt and deal with loss and damage. We also need improved understanding and capacities at all three tiers of government, federal, provincial, and local governments, as well as private and CSO stakeholders, so that they can understand and prioritize risk reduction, as well as include equity and justice in climate-smart, risk-informed development planning and implementation. And finally, we need to shift towards radical, simpler, low-cost, indigenous technologies that are greener and isn't a burden to their communities or their environment. That is all I have, Colin. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kriti, and thank you so much for completing it within the allotted time frame. So it was a very interesting and a very informative presentation on what's happening in Nepal. I mean, clearly the government are implementing measures, but they're not sufficient in scale, and it seems that they're not always effective. It was great to highlight the community measures, you know, that they're available, that they can act, they're low-cost green solutions, and also working with local government to finance those implementation. But I think the key message I picked up was the fact that the communities are not only seeing floods taking place more frequently and they're more severe, but they're also taking place outside of the monsoon season. And critically for those communities that you mentioned, it coincided with the harvest season. So now I'm pleased to introduce the third speaker. This is Afsari Begum. Afsari is the DRR, the Disaster Risk Reduction Specialist, working on the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance programme with concern in Bangladesh. Prior to this, she was the DRR lead at Practical Action in Bangladesh for 13 years. So Afsari has worked on the Alliance, the Zurich Alliance, for quite a long time now. Afsari has attended the COP as a member of the Bangladesh delegation, so is well networked with colleagues working on climate change, climate adaptation, and loss and damage issues. So Afsari, please share your experiences of the Alliance-supported flood-prone communities in Bangladesh. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Colin, and hello everyone. Greetings from Bangladesh. I'm Afsari and I work for Concern Worldwide in our Bangladesh country office as a project manager of Zurich Flood Resilience project. So in my talk, I'll be referring every time about the chor, and I'll be talking about the people, about the communities of chor, and chor refers to floodplain sediment islands. Can I have my presentation, please? Hello.
I'm sorry, the slides are there. I'm wondering if you can see them at your side.
Okay, I'm not able to see, no problem. I'm just going on. So if we start with looking at Bangladesh, over the years, Bangladesh has made really significant progress in both social and economic development. A huge investment is being made to deal with the negative impact of the climate change. Despite all these efforts, communities, families who are at the front line of climate change, they are still facing the negative consequences of it. And it is causing tremendous losses, damages almost every year. And multiple extreme events at the same time is now very common and making more difficult for the people to manage who are already in the state of vulnerability and risk. The weather-related extremes, the communities who are at the front line already experiencing the most in terms of food, water, health insecurity. These people are trying hard. They're not sitting idle. They're trying to adapt. but they have their own limitations. They lack resources and capacity to deal with such rapid changes of climate and its consequences. Somehow they're trying to adapt, they're trying to manage, and the new thing is coming, the new disaster is coming with new consequences. But the good part is that they are not losing hope. There is still the hope that they can adapt. So just a few days back, I had a conversation with some community people named Minu, Nasima, and Masood. They are all living in Chor areas of Rangpur district. Some of them are for more than 25 years. And they said that they changed their housing location for more than 10 to 12 times due to the flooding river erosions. Once they had their own land for cultivation, residents to live without any fear, life was easy and sufferings were less. But slowly things have changed. Their land houses are now underwater due to flooding, due to erosion. They tell me how changing weather is surprising them now, affecting their lives and livelihoods, and they struggle to manage, adapt the situation. Minu, who is living in Hatibandachor, apology, I'm not able to see my presentation. So, Lizzie, please change
Don't
the
worry,
slide.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, we've just moved
Minu,
on
who
to
is
the one with Nasima.
okay. Minu living in Hatibandachor with her family told me that unexpected heavy rainfall in the month of February destroyed their potato field. Groundnut field, the wind was so heavy that not even a single plant is standing straight. That means all damage. And due to continuous heavy rainfall, potatoes perished underneath the soil. They depend only on agriculture and don't have any other source of income. This unexpected rain, it has forced the family to take new loans when they are already burdened with the existing loan. She also expressed the concern that I'm scared, thinking if we don't get expected yield from this new cultivation, how would we manage to repay the loan? How would we survive? And she added a very valid concern of the storm that normally happens in the end of March and April. That means it's going to come. And I also had the chance to talk with Nasima. She also lives in the Chor. And she said that in school we have learned we have 6 seasons, but now we are experiencing 3 to 4 seasons. Last year in mid-October, due to unexpected heavy rain, we experienced new phase of flooding because this is the time when actually flood water recedes. But this is the time when these people again actually exposed to the flooding, caused devastating damages to their croplands and heavy river erosion. Similarly, there was no forecast. Everything was going well, and suddenly there were heavy hailstorms in the end of February. And again, it affected their income source and their agriculture. She said, our expenditure to adapt with this situation is too high than our earnings. And when I talked with Masood, who is also living in the Chor, said, we are finding it difficult to predict weather, to predict seasons, and to take decisions on cultivation. Many of us are changing our profession to adapt, migrating, leaving our own people, leaving our land. And he also said that earlier most of the houses, and this is true, that in rural areas had cattle, but now many of them don't because of lack of shelter. There's a crisis of feed and fodder because there is not adequate grazing land and emergence of new diseases, especially during flood and disaster situation. So overall, managing livestock has become really very, very difficult. He said with a very sad tone, once I had a dream to have my own cattle farm, but now neither I have land nor have courage to fulfill my dream. I might end up losing whatever little I have if I chase my dream. And he also said that many families are sending their very young children to work, stopping their education, despite not wanting to send them far away, but they don't have any choice. And he very strongly said that how long we can hold our starvation. We are failing to compensate each year losses, and all the loss cannot be compensated. So these are basically just few human stories of surprises, vulnerabilities, and courage of rising up above all odds resulting from the climate change impacts. And there are many more such stories. Concern worldwide under Zurich Flood Resilience Project, trying to be the partner of these vulnerable people in finding the solution. And we are working with some of these vulnerable communities and supporting them to build flood resilience housing, demonstrating technologies that support the agricultural practices adaptive to the changing nature of weather, supporting the communities to perceive the risk and plan to manage the flooding by adopting proper community plan, early warning and early intervention, solutions, closely working with national and local governments so that community-led adaptation can really move faster, backed by adequate needed investment. However, there are more adaptation work needs to be done. That is very much clear to deal with the increasing risk. And for this, high-income countries need to act now to deliver their adaptation funding commitments, which is must to support these people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Afsari, for sharing those experiences of the Chor floodplain communities that Concern is working with in Bangladesh. Clearly, there are severe impacts on the farming communities. It seems to be that the hardest hit are those people who are dependent on natural resources. It's not just livelihoods, but also physical infrastructure, houses, schools, etc. And trying to adapt, but lack the resources to respond. So it was really good that you gave us an overview of some of the activities that the project is employing to help these communities build long-term resilience. So now I hand over to our final speaker, and please, everybody who's on the call, have your questions ready. We will have a question and answer session in about 10 minutes time, and get your questions ready. So our final speaker is Reinhard Meckler. Reinhard is an author of the IPCC assessment report in the chapter Decision-Making Options for Managing Risk, and has contributed to previous IPCC reports on adaptation to extreme events, the 5th assessment report, and the 1.5 degrees C report. He is the lead for the Systemic Risk and Resilience Group at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analyses in Vienna. He has more than 20 years of experience working on socioeconomic and policy issues linked to disaster risk and climate change. So, Reinhard, over to you to wrap up what we've heard and provide your insights into the future directions and priorities. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Good day from here, from Vienna, and excited to be in this science practice exchange here about the findings from the IPCC report. I think such exchange is very important because originally or traditionally the IPCC reports target policy at global levels. So what to do about mitigation and adaptation. They're building on academic literature, but they're also increasingly building on the gray literature. So these can be reports by international institutions, can also be reports by NGOs and other players. It's not a cookbook, the IPCC. There's a lot of pages, a lot of stuff there, but it's not a cookbook for doing things. So the engagement with practice is very, very important to translate the findings into something that can lead to action. And in this spirit, I want to keep it really short and focus just a little bit on the urgency that was explained already by my previous excellent speakers, but then talk a little bit about how to tackle gaps and challenges and limits. Quickly on the urgency, and I marked in bold what's key, and we heard that from Erin, who has been a partner in the chapter 17, which is about risk management and adaptation. So we know the urgency is important. Climate change is real, it's happening today. Global warming of 1.1 degrees at global levels has already caused dangerous and widespread losses and damages to man and nature, to mankind and nature, its ecosystems and its people. Roughly half of the world's population is experiencing on an annual basis. It's experiencing water scarcity on an annual basis. There's up to 3.6 billion people in the global south that are considered highly vulnerable to climate change. It's people in informal settlements and the most vulnerable that need attention. And it is about climate change, but of course there's also socioeconomic drivers coming from different directions that heighten and increase risks. Let's go to the next one, please. The future is also a bit dismal, as we heard from Erin. It's not lost, it's not all damaged and lost, but it's not looking great, right? We know that. So future projected losses will mean multiple increases in risk by multiple times. And these are risk increases to ecosystems and to humans. Yeah, nature and people. It's a lot about sea level rise, people living close to the coastlines. We heard that from Afsari about Bangladesh, right? And yeah, it's also a lot about biodiversity, and biodiversity is good by itself, but also there's ecosystem services that we are profiting from. And it's also so that some changes and hazards are unavoidable. Sea level rise is burned or printed into the system. So some of these increases will happen for sure, irrespective of what we're doing. Of course, much more action needs to be done on climate mitigation. Key to understand about this color scheme that Erin talked about, it really shows clearly where we are in terms of risks proliferating. So at current warming, up to 4 levels of warming, of course, we want to avoid that. So it really shows the benefits of taking climate protection seriously, so reducing the emissions, but also the benefits of doing adaptation and the need for doing adaptation. Let's go to the next one, please. Key risks, maybe shortly only here, key systems. It's about low-lying coastal systems. It's about terrestrial ecosystems, living standards, food security, water security, human health, peace, and mobility. There's a summary for policymakers. It has 35 pages. You've checked it out, I'm sure. There's another 1,000 pages where lots of detail is contained that you could check out and read. And please have a look. Quite often people forget to check it out. And this is maybe an appetizer to go into some of these chapters. Next one, please. The next slide. Yeah. Okay. Opportunities. There's a dark and there's the more positive side, right? Let's start with the opportunities. Adaptation indeed is proceeding all over and effective. We've heard it from Afsari. We heard it from Kriti. There's a lot of stuff people are doing and taking forward. And our NGO colleagues in the Alliance are doing excellent work supported by the funder. So that's great. It is about reducing risk, but it's also about these multiple benefits: improved productivity, innovation, health and well-being, livelihoods enhanced. It's also a lot about biodiversity. Currently, and that's coming largely from the literature that we have, there's a lot of evidence documented for water-related hazards, so floods and droughts. EBA, so eco-based adaptation, is also in the spotlight, and there was some interesting debate about nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation. But there's also increasing evidence that is reported in the literature that we can then report on in the IPCC. So restoring wetlands, land use planning, and also like giving space to rivers and like nature-based solutions that Kriti talked about. Food security and nutrition, important link. Here, stress-tolerant crops and livestock diversification can really make a difference. So it's really about taking a broad set of options. Let's move to the next one, please. So this was about the opportunities. Now the other side of the coin, right? Unfortunately, we have adaptation gaps. And of course, we know that well. It's now documented in the report across lots of pages. Adaptation progress is quite unevenly distributed across the globe, but also within countries and systems. It's major adaptation gaps across the world. And of course, the low income are those that are most heavily feeling those gaps. It's about finance. There's never enough finance for those that didn't cause the issue and need attention. So that's well documented that more global finance needs to be taken forward. But it's also about other things. There are institutional gaps, capacity gaps, knowledge gaps, many things that need attention. The adaptation that's happening is considered, is good, is great, is going forward, but it's considered a bit fragmented, reactive and small in scale. The bottom line is more is needed to really buffer against those increases in hazards and risks all over the globe. Taking it to the next level, there's also now really substantive evidence on the limits. There's two kinds of limits. There are hard limits when you lose ecosystems for good, like the tropical coral reefs, where there's really good evidence, very unfortunately, that those may be lost at 2 degrees of global warming. There are soft limits in social systems, so in communities, for example, where there are financial, governance, institutional, and policy constraints. In the report, there's quite some documentation on those hard limits in ecosystems or in natural systems, coral reefs, mountain ecosystems. There's also increasing evidence on those soft limits in coastal settlements, for example. It's also documented across warming levels. At 1.5 degrees of warming, freshwater resources may mean for the small islands that there are hard limits to be met. 2 degrees may mean for Africa, multiple staple crops cannot be grown, and this has dire consequences for smallholder farmers. And then 3 degrees of warming, water management may become very ineffective and create limits across many regions in the south and also in the north. Let's go to the next one, please. The next slide. Yeah. So this one, I just wanted to push it to policy, loss and damage. This is important. As I indicated, there's massive losses and damages. In the future, this will increase. and they cannot totally be prevented. Lots can be done, but we're meeting limits. Current arrangements are not good enough. So at local levels, there's not enough financing, there's no insurance, there's sometimes little social protection. So we find losses and damages, residual losses and damages in all systems, but particularly in vulnerable developing countries, and they're really also concentrated with the poorer segments in society. Going to transformation, so intensification of efforts, as we heard from Kriti, may help, but there's also unhappy things that need to be considered, like managed retreat, moving communities and people around. So that also needs to be considered. Saying that, there is quite some discussion in the report that the loss and damage policy debate can help to close protection gaps in complemented DRR and CCA efforts, like disaster risk and climate change adaptation efforts. Let's move to the last slide, please. My quick summary is here, indeed, it's human-induced climate change is leading to dangerous and widespread disruption, people and nature. Adaptation is proceeding, but it's not good enough. We got a number of gaps that need attention. So we got the adaptation gap, not enough finance, not enough support trickling down to where it's needed. There's the protection gap, so further funding and support for dealing with the current and future residual losses and damages. And then there's key knowledge gaps on our side, but also on the practice and policy sides that can be closed. Overall, there's a key mitigation gap, of course, that not enough is happening. We have 1.1 degrees of warming, 1.5 is awfully close. The report says with a 50% chance, we'll be hitting 1.5 before 2040. So that needs attention as well. Thanks for the attention, and I really look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reinhard. Excellent overview of the IPCC report. Great to highlight, I think, the support and the cooperation between science and practice. The urgency, we're already at 1.1 degrees, leading to dangerous impacts. You highlighted, I think, some of the critical areas, low-lying coastal areas, critical ecosystems. You talked about some of the opportunities, things that are being done. We do have a lot of solutions, but there are many challenges. And I like the talk about the comprehensive risk management, the approach of the combination of the loss and damage, the adaptation. We recognise that there's a gap in the funding, but there are also gaps in knowledge and technology, but a lot more that could be done. So thank you very much, Reinhard. So now it's over to the audience, it's over to you. As we mentioned at the beginning, the slides and the recording for this event will be available, and I'll ask my colleague Anna to post the link in the chat box at the end. So now we're in the question and answer session. So if you've got a question, please raise your hand. We'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond. When you ask your question, please, if you can put your camera on, that would be great if the bandwidth allows. Please tell us who you are and what organisation. And also please indicate if your question is directed to a specific speaker. And please, in the interest of time, try to keep the questions short and succinct. So I see we've got a couple of hands already, so I will hand over to Zakir Hussain. Over to you.
Thank you, Colin, for the important discussions and all the panelists. But my question is that nowadays, waterlogging of flood water is more damaging than that of flood itself. So does the report highlight anything on risk-informed development? That is, so the outcome of flood or the side effect of flood is more damaging, and we could be resilient against the side effect of development itself. Thank you. Back to you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Zakir, for an excellent question. And we also have a question from Daniel.
Yeah, good morning with everyone. I'm from Ecuador, from Zurich, Ecuador. Here we are starting with the program of the flood resilience. So in your expertise, I would like to know how will you engage third parties to invest in climate programs in Climate Invest, actually climate finance. I would like to hear from your expertise. How will you do it to implement the same thing here in Ecuador?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Are there any more questions in this first round? Thank you. Siona.
Thanks very much, Colin, and thanks to all the presenters. This is really, really interesting. I just had a question to Erin. I missed the beginning of the presentation, but I was really interested in the solution, particularly around early warning systems and them being transformative. And I don't know if there is, or from anyone else on the line, around like examples of that and where maybe we could learn a little bit more about what that means in practice. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Shona. So I think we've got three excellent questions. We've got the first question from Zakir on the cascading consequences of climate impact. So the flood in Bangladesh is no longer the major damaging factor. It's the waterlogging that happens afterwards. So is there any guidance in the report on how to deal with that? We then have the question from Daniel, which is how to engage third parties to invest in climate resilience, climate finance. I think that's probably a question that I would ask all of the panelists to reflect on. Is there any examples from your own work where we've been able to catalyse maybe private sector finance in regards to climate adaptation? And then this final question posed by Shona on how early warning systems could be transformative. So, panelists, maybe Afsari, you could start with Zakir's question.
Yes, thank you so much, Zakir Bhai, for your question. You rightly said that for the flood, the waterlogging situation is actually damaging more, and that is the example we can see from like in February heavy rain, when I'm giving the example like how potatoes actually perished underneath the soil because of the continuous rain. So this is certainly an area that we really need to work, and nature-based solution is one of the area where we all are working to find out that what can be the solution, how we can actually use or how we can actually utilize the nature resources, and how we can actually manage the land so that we cannot stop the flood, but how can we utilize this flood water and channel this using the nature-based solutions to the areas where it needs most, and we can actually drain it from the places where it doesn't need as that much that is creating the waterlogged situation. So I think we are in our flood resilience project, we are working on these issues, and we are coming up also different agricultural practices, for example, like vertical gardening, that is also providing the supports and coming up with the solutions for the communities so that they can actually continue their agricultural practices even when there's a waterlogged situation. And at the same time, like we are really now trying to understand how we can actually manage our lands so that we can manage the water and store the water as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Afsari. And maybe either Reinhard or Erin would like to maybe just talk about the cascading impact, which I think is covered in the report, although I'm guessing guidance on what to do about waterlogging is not part of the report itself. So Reinhard or Erin, would you like to come in?
I could say something, but maybe Erin, or yeah, well, maybe I start very shortly. The report is clear. So disaster risks and climate-related risks have been decreased. So there has been useful action, but it's also clear that some, for example, hard embankments, hard structures may indeed lead to lock-in and to maladaptation. So this waterlogging behind dams and dikes may be one instance here. So the report is just saying, be careful, check it out, and then you also need to think about it. And there's quite some good evidence, I think collected even by Erin. So it's this issue about maladaptation, be really careful about it. But it, of course, depends also on the circumstances where you take action on things. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Reinhard. Erin, do you want to come in?
Sure, I would agree on that. I think waterlogging, I think probably appears in some contexts in the report, but the report doesn't necessarily have a recipe for a solution that will apply in every context, right? So part of the issue here is that we need a process that has everyone at the table, looks at these risks holistically in terms of compound risks, cascading risks, and says, okay, what do we need to do to reduce these risks? And so that can be things like spatial planning and changes to livelihoods, for example, because of potential waterlogging. Exactly what is the right solution in a particular location really requires a process, and is part of the message of this report. If you want me to tackle that other question on transformation, this is, so I mean, not every adaptation, not every way we respond to climate change needs to be transformational. However, early warning systems, because they are so ubiquitous, and because they tend to often put people back, say, okay, move out of the way temporarily, flood comes, and then you can go back, right? That can be problematic in a world with climate change. So how can we design early warning systems that better take into account these changing risks? What could that look like? I have, a few examples, and Caroline pointed you towards the Anticipation Hub, and we're actually going to have a conversation on this tomorrow in more detail, that is open. So I have seen some examples of cash transfers, anticipatory cash transfers that have helped people make more out-of-the-box choices. One that's been pioneered by the Red Cross, of course. The WFP is doing something interesting right now in Mali, where they're using cash in anticipation of potential food security impacts to do community designed asset creation. So saying, okay, we're going to have an investment of cash for, cash for work, et cetera. But what we're going to do is create assets so that the next drought looks different from this drought. So we're not just back to where we were, and then when the next drought comes, we're impacted in the same way, but that we've actually spent our time and our effort changing our vulnerability. So, and that's not always what we need to do, but it is something that I think we should be paying more attention to. Would be one of our messages.
Thank you very much, Erin. There was the question from Daniel from Ecuador on how to engage private sector additional finance to invest in climate action. Erin, do you want to have a go at that, and then I'll hand over to Reinhard?
Sure. I think there are lots of ways to do this. One way is just ensuring that is risk perception, making sure people actually do perceive risks. If you haven't had a flood in a while, or you're preoccupied with lots of other things that are going on in the world today that seem very urgent, maybe you're not going to be very motivated to invest in flood protection. So helping people perceive that risk, understanding that risk to their own supply chain and to their own business is, I think, particularly important as a motivating factor. And Reinhard can speak further, but I mean, dialogue has worked in the past, really just trying to get everyone at the table, making sure everyone's voices are heard, can also help motivate people to be involved and push for change. Reinhard, do you have other ideas to add to that?
Yeah, just building on what you were saying, it is a lot about reducing the immediate damages, but it's also a lot about the interfacing of damages with development. That's basically what you're saying, right? So business operations, but also communities, I said livelihoods are being affected. So it's a lot about these multiple dividends, resilience dividends, reducing the damages, but also reducing the follow-on losses and impacts down the line. Basically, Erin had this busy slide where we've shown how many SDGs do we have? 17, 18? I've forgotten, but at the high level, these are the sustainable development goals that give us a good life. And that's a joke, but the report over the this is the sixth report by the IPCC. Over the last 2 turns, it has had quite some focus on these climate resilient development pathways. How do we do something about climate change, but how do we enhance also our development and our well-being? Exactly, this one. So that's a key focus of the report, and that's quite intriguing, I guess, for public, but also private decision makers, because we got this paradox, this investment paradox. We have seen that clearly with Corona, which has been so evident, right? But it's forever impossible to explain in advance what will be happening and then incentivize investment. And after something has happened, it's also complicated to make the case this investment has made a difference. So we got this investment paradox. And that's what the report is trying to go about and also build on this framing that Erin has nicely shown. That's very, very important. Maybe as a criticism, it remains a little bit at high levels, of course. So for practice, this is exciting to bring it down to earth, and Kriti has done it, right? I've also been in the Karnali Basin. It's about reducing the flooding with nature-based solutions, but the nature-based solutions give you rattan, if this is pronounced. And with this, you build those chairs, and you get all these benefits and that help people to aspire to higher livelihoods. So I think colleagues are doing it already. Here it's a high level picture, and that's really great. And it's nicely done by colleagues, including Erin. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Reinhard. We've got another round of questions. So let's hand over to Roger, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you, and thanks to all the presenters. Really super interesting. I'm a senior associate at ODI and the British Geological Survey. Just a couple of quick things on Kriti's. I think it was Kriti, Nepal, and I'm just wondering about the sort of terming of dikes, whether you put a bio in there or not, as a kind of nature-based solutions, when nature-based solutions are essentially about mimicking or restoring natural processes which are aimed at retaining water in the landscape rather than flushing it further downstream. So I suppose a question there would be whether you solve a problem in one community upstream and then exacerbate a problem further downstream. That happens if you've got quite a rigid community-based focus, but it also happens if you don't kind of consider the spillover effects. So most of the nature-based solution stuff, and it isn't a panacea, is about retaining water in the landscape, not diverting and getting rid of it. On the kind of whole transformative resilience thing, I mean, the IPCC definitions and framing of resilience has changed a bit. If you wanted a punch up in ODI 10 years ago, just mention the word resilience. People didn't like it because it implied a bouncing back to an original state. So it's interesting to hear Erin talking about the transformation. So one element of that transformation, for example, in Nepal, might be, for example, not building dikes, but approaching the problem indirectly and allowing people to move up and out of the particular agricultural economy they're involved in, or even the particular place they're involved in. And you direct your intervention efforts, therefore, at finance, at credit, at vocational training, rather than looking at trying to maintain people within existing livelihood systems and existing places, because long term, that may not work.
Thanks, Roger.
That's over and out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roger. Carl, over to you. If you can keep your questions short, we're running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just did a quick word search through the report, and I didn't pick up anything in there about kind of issues around land ownership and distribution, and the extent to which that could be a blocker or enabler of adaptive behaviour. So I just wonder if I'm missing something, or whether that's a topic that might be worth exploring.
Thank you very much, Carl. And Finn, our final question.
Yeah, thanks. I'm also going a bit in this direction of these key enablers and the barriers of resilience implementation. And I'm also wondering a bit what the report can tell us about this practitioner gap. So Reinhard already mentioned a bit, this all stays a bit high level. But isn't there some need also to close this gap in the implementation side, that we actually are on track with our implementations and are not running behind it with the climate change? So just wondering what the IPCC can tell us here.
Thank you very much, Finn. So maybe we could ask Kriti to come in on that first question from Roger on the biodikes and the nature-based solutions mimicking natural systems. And is the current construction of a biodike in one community passing the problem downstream to the next community? But I do know that you can talk it in more detail about the transformational aspects, particularly the vocational training, and how providing community members with vocational training, such as the cookery school, which has been quite successful, I think, in the project, has been able to help people to invest in resilience building. So, Kriti, would you like to have a go at answering that question?
Yes, thank you, Colin, and thank you, Roger. Well, biodikes does not transfer the risk from one community to other. It is basically a method of slope stabilization, and with the help of the spurs that are there, it actually reduces the velocity of the flood and diverts the water, but with a lesser velocity. So that is one answer that I have for you. And the second is, when you're talking about moving the communities from the vulnerable areas, there are a lot of factors when it comes to that. Firstly, these communities have already been displaced from previous flooding events and have been displaced from the from the national park declaration. So these communities have moved from one areas to another, and these are already indigenous communities who do not have a good socioeconomic background, and many of these communities have been displaced from mid-hills due to other hazards such as landslides and all, and are forced to live near the river banks and in this vulnerable area. So that is one other problems that we have when we are talking about displacing these communities or moving these communities to other areas. But so that is one of the response. And like Colin said, and we are not only building biodikes, but we're also helping community build their resilience through other livelihood interventions, both off-farm and on-farm. So we're also giving them trainings when it comes to fast food restaurants, trainings such as masonry and others, through which they can gain more income and invest in their resilience. And also, we are also giving them trainings when it comes to a raised nursery, raised granary, those kind of skills, so that they can survive and thrive in the flooding periods.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kriti. We are out of time. Erin, thank you so much for adding the links in the chat box for everybody. The questions around land tenure, there is apparently a chapter in the report that covers issues around land ownership. And I mean, Finn, your question on, how do we close the gap in implementation, I think is probably a discussion that we could continue for several minutes. So thank you, everybody. The presentation and the slides will be available on the flood portal at some point in the next couple of days. And thank you, everybody, for joining the event. We look forward to welcoming you to the next Alliance event in the near future. So on behalf of all the panelists, thank you, everybody. Thank you for the excellent questions, and see you again soon. Goodbye.